In day 2 of the Chessable Masters, Praggnanandhaa was playing against Magnus Carlsen. He had the white pieces here, and it's always a spicy encounter. Anytime you get these young guns playing against the reigning world champion, it's intriguing to see what these young talents can do against the incumbent champion. So Pragg kicked off with e4 here, Magnus goes e5, we went in for this Roy Lopez with bishop to b5, pawn a6, the bishop dropped back, this knight came to f6, and now pawn d3, not the c3 move, so Pragg doesn't want to go in for any of the Marshall Gambit stuff with pawn to d5 from black. Now we had bishop to c5, so that one comes outside the pawn chain, a very popular way to play at the top level. Pawn to c3, prepares to support d4 later. Pawn b5, kicked that bishop back, it dropped to b3, and now pawn d6, defended that central pawn, prepares to continue development. And now you can castle here, it's one of the main ways to play, knight b to d2, queen e2, many moves of course, but Pragg goes for this bishop g5 move, a less common way to play, because the bishop now comes outside the pawn chain, and after h6, bishop h4, it's going to soon be kicked all the way back to g3. Sometimes it's good there, sometimes it's not so good, gets a bit trapped and blocked out of the game. So the bishop now dropped back to b6 from Magnus. We had pawn a4 from Pragg. He starts undermining that queenside structure, a very standard idea, and Magnus doesn't go bishop to b7 here. Instead he goes rook b8, and this is the more precise way to play, because after captures here, pawn recaptures, now the rooks don't come off the board down the a file, and so after knight to a3, targeting that pawn, the rook actually kind of x-ray defends the pawn, so you've got tactical ideas of moving the bishop away with checks and things like that, and that's how black's holding onto this pawn, that's why black wants the rooks on the board. g5 was now played by Magnus, so it kicks this bishop back, and this is what I mean, could be good here one day, blasting, or could get a bit blocked out, black plays around it. Always a double-edged way to play with the bishop g5 stuff. Knight a5 now from Magnus, so he targets this bishop, and again, if white takes that free pawn on b5, it's just not working tactically due to the problems down the b file. So the bishop dropped back to c2 instead. And now the most precise move here was bishop to d7, just defending the pawn, but instead Magnus played this interesting b4 move. Now he pressures the knight of course, and that knight doesn't actually have a good hop to make. You know, you want to bring it to c4, but this knight is covering the square. So that's why Pragg takes here. Yes, it kind of ruins that pawn structure a little bit, but it is the most precise move. You could have done that first, or bishop a4, but either way we kind of transpose, so the knight drops back, now bishop a4, and that knight is pinned, needs protection, so bishop d7 comes. Now this knight hits c4, this is the point, Pragg can land his knight on that nice square, but Magnus wins back his pawn now, he takes on b4, the bishops come off here, and now the knight recaptures, the most precise move, because that knight needed improving from f6. It didn't really have a lot of jumps. Okay, maybe you could have come to h5 and f4, but from d7, it can now look to go to c5 and then into e6 perhaps. Sometimes the knight comes back to f8 and e6 or g6. You know, it's a very flexible square on d7. So both players now castle their kings. Here Pragg actually picks up on b6, so he chops that bishop pair. It was a dangerous piece. The rook recaptures here, and now Pragg goes d4. This was his other idea of chopping off that bishop. Now you don't really want to be capturing on d4 just yet, bringing the knight into the game. So Magnus goes knight c6, he drops this one back, opens up the rook here, and also pressures in the centre. Now Pragg didn't close the centre with pawn to d5 here, then these knights could actually get quite powerful later on. Say you drop into e7, well you can look to come to g6 and then f4, black might be going f5 soon, and the knights are always a bit better in closed positions than bishops, so there's good pressure for black to offset this backwards pawn on the c file, plus obviously black's pressuring b2. So Pragg didn't close. Equally, if you take on e5 and start liquidating things, should be quite drawish. So instead he played rook to c1, a good move, coming to the half open file, and now black can't pick up on b2 here, or you lose your knight on c6. So that's why Magnus took on d4, the knight recaptured, pawn takes, queen takes, a nice central square, but black does have play to offset white's central control, play on the b2 pawn, and now the knight comes to c5, could be coming to e6 one day, a lovely blockading square. And white would love to go e5 already here, undermine the protection of this knight with the pawn, then you can try to take it, but the problem with doing it straight away is that then knight b3 comes, forking queen and rook. So that's why the rook came to the d file in this position here. We didn't have the immediate e5, but now the knight hits e6, a rock solid square, both an attacking and a defensive piece, really beautiful, kicks the queen back to c3, and now it's quite interesting here. Magnus plays the very human move, but what the computer wants to do is go queen to e7 here, and actually allow white to go e5 if they want to play this move. And the whole idea is that then you go pawn d5. Now the white rook can take that pawn. That's why it's quite hard to kind of spot this and understand it as a human. But then queen to b4 comes. And the whole idea is that this pawn is actually very weak, hard to hold on to. I mean, say you start dropping back with rook d2. Well, we can bring another rook to the file. You get that pressure on the pawn, and eventually black should win the pawn back. This one's always held by the knight, of course. Can't be attacked, there's no light squared bishop, so it should be just a balanced equality position. So an interesting concept that I found, just kind of wanted to share that one. But Magnus didn't go queen e7, he played the much more human move of pawn to f6. He wants to stop that e5 break altogether. And now after f6, Pragg goes f4. This is the challenge though with Magnus's position. Pragg's getting some nice central control now. Magnus is still solid, but he's a bit under pressure, of course. The queen now came to e7 here, and pawn b4 from Pragg. He takes away c5 from the knight. Magnus now dropped his rook back. He reconnects these rooks, good prophylaxis. Maybe one day he'll challenge the a file, who knows. And now here Pragg, I think, should have just waited on the position a bit. He's clearly better here. He's got that space. You could go queen to c4, let's say, just pin the knight to the king. A few more improving moves. Maybe you do something with your king safety. Just make black sweat a bit. There's not a lot of active plans for black here. But instead, Pragg goes pawn to f5. It's not a bad move. You kick back the knight, you open up the bishop, but you are now closing the structure. The knight can hop back, and they usually do quite well in these closed structures. So the rook came to d4 now, holds that e4 pawn, knight to f7, very logical remanoeuvring, coming to this rock solid e5 square. Rook to c4 from Pragg, he hits that backwards pawn, rook b7 defends, rook c1 attacks again, and now this rook came to the b file. Good move by Magnus. He doesn't want to go passive with rook c8 here, so instead he's saying, okay, if you take my pawn, I'll take your pawn after this exchange, and the position's just completely equal, and he's correct. And so that's why Pragg didn't immediately liquidate the position. There's nothing to play for after that. And again, the best move here is actually the subtle move of dropping the queen back to d2. The whole idea of this one is that now if you go knight to e5, you can actually retreat the rook down the file, and you keep pressure against this pawn, rendering it impossible for black to actually take here, because then white takes on c7, and this is just terrible. It's actually completely lost. As soon as the rook hits the 7th like this, no matter where the queen goes, I mean, say you go to d8 to hold this pawn, well, now we can check from d5, and when the king goes away, we're chopping the knight, then we're invading on f7, it's curtains, and there's very similar themes. Whether this queen goes to e8, then you lose the pawn. If it goes to f8, well, we can chop first. Just all game over for black, really. So you can't let that invasion happen on the 7th here. After the rook retreats, well, you would have to play some waiting move as black, and then white can start looking at things like h4, just nibbling away at that pawn structure on the king side. But Pragg didn't quite show the patience once again of going queen to d2. I mean, time is low, of course, so don't want to criticise too much. Instead, he went pawn h4, But the problem with this is a very concrete tactical one, because now Magnus can capture, the bishop takes back, looks nice, you've ruined the black pawn structure, but as soon as the bishop left this diagonal here, now the knight can hop into e5 without being taken by the bishop, and in this line the queen's not on d2. So you can't retreat the rook, it can't come to c5 of course, it can't come to c6, the knight controls. So you have to actually crash through on c7 here, but now black's just liquidating. This is the problem. Pragg's now blown the advantage, Magnus has equalised. So we're heading towards a draw here, or are we? So it's white to move in this position, black just took on b4. Now the obvious move here is taking this unprotected pawn on f6, but this runs into a tactical issue. The rook can come to b1 and check, and regardless of whether you go to f2 or h2, there's the same knight g4 check problem, you're losing the unprotected bishop. So you can't take that f6 pawn, it's immune. So instead Pragg goes rook e7, looking to come to e6 one day, pressure these two pawns. But now a good move from Magnus, pawn d5, more tactics in the air. You can't capture that one, or now you lose your bishop here. So after d5, Pragg went king to f1, excellent move, coming away from some of this tactical stuff with all the checks and things going on. We now had the captures on e4, but now the bishop captures here, he grabs one back, he hits the knight, and here Magnus makes a shocking one move blunder on the spot. He should just go knight to d3 here, and the game should be heading towards a draw, but he hops the knight into g4, just completely forgetting about rook g7 check, picking up his whole knight on g4 here. Really crazy from the world champion. He did something similar against Jordan van Forest recently as well, so it's just slightly crept into his game here. Not what he wants to see. Anyway, Pragg takes the victory. Now Magnus still had a good day, he's having a good tournament. He beat Mishra, for example, the young 13-year-old prodigy, and these are the standings at the end of day 2. So a great event as always, really hotting up. Soon we'll be going to knockouts. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're not yet subscribed, do consider subscribing to never miss another. And if you want to see another epic chess match, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.